It's also an honour to introduce our next speaker, Nathan Brown, who will be known to many of you. He is professor in the English department and also chair in poetics at Concordia University in Montreal. And he has written an enormous amount of books, including Baudelaire's Shadow, and has, in fact, a translation of Fleur du Mal coming out, is it, with Verso, I think, Nathan, which is extremely exciting. He's worked on an enormous range of things from theory and literature and so on. So it's fantastic to have him here. And we'll do the same again, 30 or so minutes, followed by discussions. So over to you, Nathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks to all the organizers of the event. Thanks in particular to Bara and Gregor for the invitation. How's the mic? Is that good? Yeah. Okay, so I'll jump in. Absolute Alienation is the title of the paper. And I'll begin with two epigraphs in a set of contrasting mood from the 1790s. So one is from Novalis. We are on a mission. Our calling is the cultivation of the earth. Zum Bildung der Erde. Bildung der Erde. And then Hölderlin, a letter to his half-brother Karl Goethe, 1793. Oh, and if I find a soul who, like me, strives for that goal, there is nothing more sacred and dearer to me in the world. And that goal, brother of mine, the shaping, the improvement of the human race, the goal that in our life there will perhaps only attain imperfectly, that goal in our life we will perhaps only attain imperfectly, but which the better generations to come will attain the more easily, the more we have helped to prepare for it in our particular sphere of activity. That goal lives, I know, in your soul too. Reflecting upon such statements from the 1790s, inspired by the context of the French Revolution and Kant's epochal regrounding of philosophy, it would be impossible to express the depth of bitterness and despair occasioned by the outcome of modernity. Unfortunately, we're in a position to articulate this outcome with grueling certainty. On the one hand, the ongoing destruction of the habitable environment by global warming. On the other hand, the ongoing annihilation of attention, the hollowing out of the psyche, and the progressive displacement of thought by smartphones, social media, and artificial intelligence. So one, the objective destitution of terrestrial nature, and two, the subjective destitution of the embodied soul. And both of these are the outcome of the capitalist determination of technological development since the Industrial Revolution. What we will find as these developments converge is, for the rich, the continuing marginalization of the embodied life world by simulated environments designed by video game corporations. And for the poor, the sequestering of desperate migrants in camps, where they're not only stored in a kind of geopolitical and existential limbo, but also starved, beaten, raped, and murdered. 2 decades into the 21st century, it is necessary to revise F.H. Bradley's dictum, cited by Adorno in Minima Moralia. When everything is bad, it must be good to know the worst. No, in fact, it is also bad to know the worst. As my friend Alexei Kukulyevich might say in the manner of Beckett, when everything is bad, it must be worse to know the worst. But rather than doubling down in this manner, we might simply acknowledge the present irrelevance of theoretical critique to the outcome of modernity, an irrelevance that has been rigorously and ironically demonstrated by what Marx called the real movement of history. The fact and the feeling of this irrelevance are what I call absolute alienation. At the end of the phenomenology of spirit, traced by Hegel in the early 19th century, the interiorizing recollection of the movement of spirit's moments came to fruition in absolute knowing, quote, the highest freedom and the highest assurance of spirit's knowing of itself. 200 years later, the result of recollecting absolute knowing itself from the perspective of spirit's subsequent misadventures is absolute alienation. It is the certainty that the structural determinations of modernity have unfolded in a manner quite indifferent to whatever benefits the achievement of conceptually grasped history was supposed to confer. In the work of Marx, the concept of alienation undergoes a major transformation that I think is crucial to understanding its modulations throughout the 20th century. And here I agree with Althusser. There is an epistemological break in Marx's oeuvre, after which the concept of alienation undergoes a tendential displacement. So in the last chapter of my 2021 book, Rationalist Empiricism, I argue that this displacement is affected by another concept, which plays a key structural role in Volume 1 of Capital, the concept of Scheidung, or separation. The concept of alienation depends upon a logic of estrangement, exteriorization, or objectification, whereby the product of one's labor, the contribution of one's living activity to the human community, comes to confront one as an alien object, hostile and antithetical to one's own interests. So one is alienated from an essence, an activity, or a form of existence that is properly one's own. The concept of separation does not necessarily obey this logic of exteriorization or estrangement. Separation can occur between elements rather than from what is properly one's own. And what Marx calls a process of separations, the term is Scheidungsprozess, requires a structuralist rather than a humanist approach. The concept of alienation remains active in Marx's mature discourse, but the emphasis certainly shifts to the process of separation, conceived as a structural historical concept. And the operation of Scheidung as a technical term is somewhat recessed in Capital. So, for example, it doesn't appear in the table of contents where most of the major concepts of the book do. But it's central to his argument. Not only is the division of labor theorized as a Scheidungsprozess, but Marx also argues in a striking declaration in chapter 3 of Capital that, quote, the division of labor converts the product of labor into a commodity and thereby makes necessary its conversion into money. This is the case because the division of labor, understood as a process of separation, it is the division of labor understood that way that divides workers not only from the products of their labor, but also from the synthesis of skills required to produce those products, resulting in what Marx calls a system of all-round social dependence. Such a system is the condition of possibility for the conversion of the product of labor into a commodity, understood as a product whose value is determined by socially necessary labor time, and as a product emerging from a process of production that generates surplus value through surplus labor time. So the division of the labor makes necessary the conversion of the commodity into money insofar as the process of exchange in capitalist societies requires a level of abstraction adequate to the determination of value, which inheres not in any material trait of the object or its use value, but rather in the average labor time required to produce it, considered within the capitalist system as a whole. So from this brief outline, we can see the total integration of Marx's concept of Scheidungsprozess into the processual vocabulary of Capital, which is one thing that I want to highlight, this processual vocabulary. So the division of labor consolidates the separation of labor from property, which inaugurates capitalist social relations. So thus the labor process, Arbeitsprozess, is thus both separated from and constitutive of the valorization process, Verwertungsprozess. This separation requires a process of exchange, Austauschprozess, right, enabled by the conversion of commodities into money. The realization of surplus value through exchange re-enters the process of production, Produktionsprozess, as capital, and then the expanding reproduction of this valorization of capital is a process of accumulation, Accumulationsprozess. So at every level there's a processual vocabulary in Marx, and all of it can be conceived as a process of separation. This is what I try to show in this chapter. The coordination of all of these processes constitutes the unity in separation of capitalist social relations. Thus, the transformation of the concept of alienation into a distinctively structural concept of separation enables an enormous expansion of theoretical range and conceptual integration in Marx's mature work. Okay, so now let's jump ahead 100 years to Guy Debord's deployment of the terms separation and alienation in the Society of the Spectacle, so 1967. Here, both the terms retain the basic sense that Marx gave them while also undergoing a contextual transformation that in many ways stems from the 20th century modification of the problem of organization. And I think here specifically from the history of practical and theoretical disputes between Bolshevism and left communism. So first, Debord separates the problem of separation within a historical frame, which takes us back to our epigraphs from the 1790s and to the historical breakthrough, theoretical breakthrough of Hegel's phenomenology. Debord writes, "The class struggles of the long revolutionary period, ushered in by the rise of the bourgeoisie, have evolved in tandem with the thought of history, with the dialectic, with a truly historical thinking that is not content simply to seek the meaning of what is, but aspires to understand the dissolution of everything that is, and in the process to dissolve all separations." We can see Debord's absorption of the scope of the content of separation in Marx's mature theory. That is, to think that communism, understood as the real movement of history, would dissolve all separations requires us to grasp the manifold sense in which not only the division of labor, but also the history of capitalism itself could be understood as a process of separation. Debord's politics is exorbitantly utopian. Communism would not merely involve ownership of the means of production by a free association of producers, circulating the products of labor through free giving and receiving from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Supposedly, it would be the dissolution of all separations. So, Debord's reference to this dissolution of all separations implies not only a dissolution of the capitalist separations analyzed by Marx, but also the dissolution of their survival in the separations of state socialism, as well as in the organizational forms taken by anti-capitalist struggles. His critique of separation is a critique of both capitalist social relations and of democratic centralism and state socialism as the organizational form taken by Bolshevism. He writes, "The mirage of Leninism today has no basis outside the various Trotskyist tendencies, where the conflation of the proletarian project with a hierarchical organization grounded in ideology has stolidly survived all the evidence of that conflation's real consequences." For Debord, the hierarchical separation of the proletariat from control over its own organizational forms is the source of an alienation which is interior to class struggle itself, and thereby only aids the reproduction of capitalist social relations. So let me read a longer passage from The Society of the Spectacle. "But when the proletariat discovers that its own externalized power conspires in the continual reinforcement of capitalist society, no longer merely thanks to the alienation of its labor, but also thanks to the forms taken by unions, parties, and institutions of state power that it had established in pursuit of its own self-emancipation, then the proletariat must also discover, through concrete historical experience, that it is indeed that class which is totally opposed to all reified externalizations and all specializations of power. The proletariat is the bearer of a revolution that can leave no other sphere of society untransformed, that enforces the permanent domination of the past by the present, and demands a universal critique of separation." So here we find a dense coordination of the terms alienation, externalization, and separation. The alienation of the proletariat through the externalizations of its organizational forms requires a universal critique of separation, directed as much against reifications of communist praxis as against the alienation of labor and capitalism. The Society of the Spectacle is above all a councilist manifesto, arguing for workers' councils as the only organizational form of proletarian struggle and productive association that would be capable of overcoming the separations not only of capitalism but also of anti-capitalist struggle and state socialism. He says, "The historic mission to establish truth in the world can only be carried out by that class which is able to effect the dissolution of all classes, subjecting all power to the disalienating form of a realized democracy, the councils in which practical theory exercises control over itself and surveys its own action." So councils are a disalienating form of proletarian organization, and this disalienation within the workers' movement is required for the critique and the dissolution of all separation. We could say that Debord's argument synthesizes Marx's structural analysis of separation and capital with his humanist critique of alienation in the 1844 manuscripts. The structure of historical theoretical movement here is Hegelian. The disalienating activity of the workers' councils overcomes the apparent opposition between forms of separation proper to both capitalism and proletarian struggle. Councils are the concrete form of the proletarian revolution, knowing itself and its own activity. They are the internalizing recollection of the history of class struggle and its impasses, in and through its own imminent interrogation. So for Debord, Workers' councils are the organs through which history comes to know itself as self-emancipating movement, as he puts it, radically separated from the world of separation, so final turn of the dialectical screw. So again, The Society of the Spectacle was published in 1967. 56 years later, let's consider how far we are from this prognosis, and in just what sense it seems so distant. In fact, debates concerning the problem of organization among communists are not particularly different. In the crucible of proletarian struggles, the problem of organizational form is always central to the content of those movements themselves, at the crux of theory and praxis. And on the sidelines or in the aftermath of those struggles, one still finds commentators crowing over their organizational failures or ridiculing the futility of the debates themselves, as if whatever they think the solution would have been was not already at issue within the struggle itself. Indeed, there is an objectivity to the problem of organization. The debate between Lenin and left communists, for example, was in my opinion expressive of a real contradiction due to which both parties were both right and wrong. That is, Lenin was probably right that concessions to parliamentarism and the centralization of the party's power was necessary for the revolution to survive. On the other hand, left communists were probably right that displacing the organizational primacy of the Soviets really did compromise the communist content of the revolution. There's a certain objective alienation involved in the conditions of possibility for communist movements or socialist states to survive at all in a capitalist world. As Paul Maddock has persuasively argued, organs of proletarian power are compelled to take on capitalist forms precisely by the exigencies of anti-capitalist struggle. That is, in order to survive in the world we actually live in, communist forms tend to become separated from communist content. But what has been irrevocably transformed with respect to the moment of Debord's treatise is the viability of the historical teleology that it continued to transmit in the grand tradition of Hegel and Marx. And this is emphatically not because of what was called the end of master narratives during the moment of so-called postmodernism, nor is it because of the supposed triumph of liberalism over actually existing socialism in the late 80s and early 90s. In fact, I would say that the Pyrrhic victories of liberalism and epistemological relativism only serve to prop up the embattled unity of communists and socialists by giving them a series of easy targets. That is, as long as Western revisionists whined about totalitarianism while denying their own blood-drenched imperialism, as long as relativists declared the end of master narratives while thus propagating a new one, as long as liberals declared the end of history while failing to notice the structural impasses of their own politics, as long as all of this constituted a kind of political common sense that was regnant in the 1990s and the early 2000s, communist intellectuals could pat themselves on the back for their resolute commitment, for the maturity of their historical consciousness, and for their superior powers of structural analysis. That persistence was rewarded by the schadenfreude of the 2008 economic crisis and by the exhilarating wave of struggles that followed. But over the past 20 years, perhaps even since the moment of Debord's intervention in the late 1960s, perhaps even since Marx's meditations on the ecological consequences of the mode of production, perhaps even since what Debord calls the long revolutionary period ushered in by the rise of the bourgeoisie, the romantic unease with industrialization and urbanization, there has been a creeping realization that the history of capitalism portends quite another master narrative than either the triumph of liberal democratic equilibrium or its communist overcoming through a disalienating fusion of theoretical knowledge and practical life, what Debord calls the dissolution of all separations. But no sooner was this creeping realization giving a name than its content was obscured. So the Anthropocene is a terrible name for the epoch of global warming driven by fossil fuels extraction. That is, it's not sufficiently structural. But rather than promoting the clunky term capitalocene, we might as well just call this epoch modernity, the name of the history of capitalism. Thus, it should come as no surprise that the outcome of modernity is identical with what Marx already knew it would be, were it not sublated by a worldwide communist revolution, the destruction of ecological conditions of possibility for equality and freedom. Of course, versions of this story have become one of the most boring narratives one can relate. Climate change is synecdoche for the dialectic of enlightenment. That sense of narrative tedium is part of what I mean by absolute alienation. But it does matter how one relates this narrative. Consider the version we find in Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, which expands upon his influential 2009 article in Critical Inquiry. So the main argument here is that the Anthropocene involves a collapse of the distinction between human history and natural history, the global and the planetary. The explanatory framework and the prescriptions are Latourian and new materialist. So he writes, if the climate crisis of human flourishing brings into view planetary processes that humans in the past simply ignored, bracketed, or took for granted, it is reasonable to ask for an ethic that allows humans to develop, quote, everyday tactics for cultivating the ability to discern the vitality of matter. So there he's quoting Jane Bennett. And Chakrabarty thankfully acknowledges that, quote, post-humanism itself cannot address the political. But what he suggests is unfortunately, in addition, is unfortunately more of the same. He says, any theory of the planetary crisis humans face today would have to begin from the same old premise of securing human life, but now ground itself in a new philosophical anthropology. That is, in a new understanding of the changing place of humans in the web of life, and in the connected but different histories of the globe and the planet. With respect to these connected but different histories, capitalism is sometimes mentioned, but Chakrabarty really doesn't have much to say about it. For those who acknowledge that the capitalist mode of production is in fact the structural cause of global warming, he has only some critical remarks before swiftly returning his attention to the need for what he calls an anthropological clearing, away from the specialness of man and toward an attitude of wonder and reverence that would be planet-centric rather than human-centric. I would note that this recapitulates the form, if not the content, of the Enlightenment and Romantic thinking that's supposedly being criticized. That is, we should change our values and thereby cultivate the earth. This is the liberal theory of climate change, which devolves to the level of a kind of global warming hallmark card. On the other hand, in Fossil Capital, Andreas Malm has given us a serious account of the historical relation between capitalism and fossil fuels extraction. And he's also given us, in the progress of this storm, a necessary critique of the epistemological and political obscurantism of actor network theory, new materialism, and posthumanism. Against the ethical liberalism of these discourses, Malm urges militant struggle, and he's surely right that revolutionary anti-capitalist militancy is the only serious political response to the climate crisis with two goals in mind: no extraction, no emissions. But Malm does not seem interested in taking very seriously the political impasses of his own approach to Marxist politics. So on the one hand, he calls for acts of volunteer sabotage, which ethically is fine with me, but what happened when the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up last year? When sources of fossil fuel are cut off in one place, they spring up in others in what amounts to a kind of geopolitical shell game. And this usually results in more emissions, not less. So in that case, renewed extraction of coal and oil rather than natural gas, or the tapping of previously protected reserves, new contracts for drilling, etc. On the other hand, Malm is a Leninist who doesn't seem very interested in evaluating whether changes in the process of production and the global segmentation of the working class have actually constitutively altered conditions of possibility for Leninist politics. So it's certainly refreshing to hear Malm call for less Latour and more of Lenin. But consider the passage that he cites by Perry Anderson on the question of the level of agency that was achieved by the Bolsheviks. So here's this nice passage from Perry Anderson. There are those collective projects which have sought to render their initiators authors of their collective mode of existence as a whole, in a conscious program aimed at creating or remodeling whole social structures. It is the modern labor movement that has really given birth to this quite new conception of historical change, and it is with the advent of what its founders called scientific socialism that, in effect, for the first time, collective projects of social transformation were married to systematic efforts to understand the processes of the past and the future to produce a premeditated future. The Russian Revolution is, in this respect, the inaugural incarnation for a new kind of history founded on this unprecedented form of agency. This is a stirring passage. But the collective mode of existence of the modern labor movement is not what it used to be. So as the Théorie Communiste has analyzed in detail, the global restructuring of capital since the 1970s has resulted in a tendential segmentation of labor as the very means of the unification of capital. The globalization of supply chains and logistical networks involves a geographical and political division of the means of production. That is a new process of separation which poses serious problems for the prospect of seizing the means of production in a manner coordinated by a conscious program that would remodel whole social structures. International supply chains, not individual factories, are now the integral unit of the process of production, separated from the forms of unity that would have enabled collective proletarian control over the process of production. The analysis of the decline of the workers' movement by Théorie Communiste has often been mistaken for a kind of normative argument, as if Théorie Communiste wanted a programmatic workers' politics to end, or as if they think it doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. On the contrary, their analysis is a descriptive argument grounded in a sober structural analysis of the relation between the composition of the process of production and the problem of organization on national and international levels. But more importantly for my purposes here, the problem is that climate change itself has altered the fundamental basis of the class relation as it will play out in the future of the 21st century. That is, very simply, some areas of the globe will remain habitable and some will not. Proletarians in some parts of the world will have to work in impossible temperatures in order to reproduce their existence, and those in other parts of the world will not. This will be the fundamental political division of the second half of the 21st century. It's certainly a class division, but it's also a division determined by geography. Those proletarians and those surplus populations who will have to work and live in uninhabitable temperatures will have to migrate, or they will die. And it seems probable that some 500 million to 1 billion people will have to migrate in search of livable climates by 2075 or 2100. Notably, this geographical determination divides rather than unifies the proletariat as an international class. As we have seen, those proletarians who do not live in what will become uninhabitable regions will likely tend to resist the migration of those who do, often making common cause with brutal border regimes and neo-fascist forms of populist politics. So this is a new form of what Marx called the process of separation. And it also constitutes a different form of the alienation of the proletariat from its own power than that analyzed by Debord. Such alienation is not due to the separation of hierarchical organizations from the imminent self-determination of workers' councils. Rather, it's due to the effect of geographical contingency on a new form of the class relation. Meanwhile, over and over again, we see evidence of the predictable inertia of fossil capital. Even amid halting transitions to electric vehicles and renewable fuels, global carbon dioxide emissions are still rising. Geopolitical contingencies like the war in Ukraine are always lying in wait to reverse priorities. The EU is cracking down on Chinese electric vehicles and their markets precisely because China's state subsidies actually make them affordable. In regions with oil and gas resources, the capitalist bottom... In regions with oil and natural gas resources, the capitalist bottom line is that if there's still money to be made from the extraction of fossil fuels, it will be made. Meanwhile, it seems to be far from the case that the proletariat will be unified by the convergence of human history and natural history portended by climate change. On the contrary, the uneven geographical distribution of climate risk constitutes the most brutal phase in the process of separation in the history of capitalism. So we might consider the historical position we're in vis-a-vis the relation between knowledge and collective determination through the recent work of Kohei Saito on Marx's ecological thinking. Saito shows persuasively, I think, that Marx, particularly in his later notebooks and letters, arrives at a position on the relation between nature and the mode of production that might be described as degrowth communism. He argues that Marx goes beyond the attachment of historical materialism to a teleological view that expanding forces of production will lead to and support communist social relations, arriving instead at a view compatible with a more contingent understanding of historical progress and with communist forms of communal reproduction that would not necessarily rely upon increasing levels of industrial production. Personally, I'm convinced by Saito's reading of Marx and by his arguments not only for the necessity of degrowth, but also that communist social relations are necessary to bring about degrowth. But what's painful about reading Saito is that his analysis of Marx points us precisely to the period in which such a perspective would have mattered. Well, that is the second half of the 19th century. how does the history of the 20th century appear retrospectively from the perspective of Marx's ecological thinking? Well, first of all, it's important to note that dating the Anthropocene to 1945 obscures the grounding of what has been called the Great Acceleration of the post-war period in the longer history of the capitalist mode of production. That is, even if emissions rose precipitously after 1945, that is the structural effect of the entire history of capitalist modernity, which should be included in the periodization. If we thus adopt a Marxist and communist perspective on this structural logic, the question becomes, what would have been necessary to intervene in the history of capitalist modernity prior to the Great Acceleration? The answer is, first, the successful internationalization of communist revolution. Second, the possibility thereby of developing social relations and relations of production in a manner that would not be determined by competition among capitalist states. Third, in that context, the recognition that continuing to tie the development of productive forces to fossil fuels extraction would have catastrophic effects on the planetary environment. And fourth, the rational planning of degrowth communism in accordance with that recognition. Now, I'm not saying exactly that could have happened, but there was indeed a moment at which the internationalization of communist revolutions seemed and perhaps was structurally possible, the aftermath of the Russian Revolution in 1917. From this perspective, we might describe the post-war Great Acceleration as follows. Global warming is the result of the defeat of communist internationalism following the Russian Revolution. This makes sense because it is only the internationalization of communist social relations that could have enabled forms of rational planning detached from interstate competition over the accumulation of capital. Whether this could have happened or not is the only condition of possibility that could have been enabled a collective rational response to global warming. My point is not that communists failed to internationalize the revolution. This is not a matter of mere errors or failures of will or strategy. There were real structural and historical determinations of the course of the revolution. It's not as though things simply could have gone differently. But what I'm saying is, understanding global warming not only is the consequence of capitalist modernity, but also is the consequence of the defeat of communist internationalism and the social and economic reforms it could have made possible, offers not only a Marxist but also a communist approach to the Great Acceleration. In this view, the prescriptions of Saito and others for communist degrowth are both correct and belated. They require a context in which those prescriptions could be implemented, and in this sense, Malm is more or less correct. Something like the revolution, stemming into an internationalization of that revolution, would be the form of collective determination necessary to halt and reverse warming. But what I call absolute alienation is the historical knowledge that conditions of possibility for such a sequence have already passed us by. That global warming results from the defeat of what is being nostalgically called for. To be clear, this has nothing to do with wrapping up. This has nothing to do with a general political pessimism. What I'm saying has very little relation to most levels of political determination, to the local struggles and forms of social organizing that make up political work at its most important. But what it does have to do with is what Anderson calls systematic efforts to understand the process of past and present and to produce a premeditated future. On this level, the collective rationality of communist politics has no ground to stand on. The future of politics at an international level appears as a brutal confrontation between wealthy states and rootless populations, the former massively armed, determined to preserve their borders and to crush any internal resistance to that preservation, the latter's strength resisting only in sheer numbers, which is indeed a formidable power, but ultimately unlikely to overcome the drone and robot armies of the present and the future. What I think realistic hope looks like in this scenario is not the systematic production of a premeditated future, but rather the capacity of those reduced to bare life to eke out a meager existence through contingent forms of collective support and nomadic resilience. It is not impossible that a complete disorganization of the present global order of things may result in a new epoch of differently distributed collective life that might be genuinely subsequent to capitalist modernity. But what I'm calling absolute alienation consists in knowing that the price will be too high, and that such a future therefore cannot be an object of affirmation. It consists in knowing that, on a global level, the outcome of modernity has already been separated from rational collective determination. It's this separation which inscribes alienation directly in our rational understanding of the history of modernity. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Nathan. Oh, okay, I also have some comments, but I can see hands already, and I don't want to hog too much. If I get time, I'll ask mine. So have Gregor, and then I'll come to the back for you, Cosmo. I can just jump on the two. You go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. This was really, really interesting. I've always felt that the looming ecological catastrophe opens up the possibility for community, in the sense that obviously by following the logic of every man for himself, or every woman for herself, we're not going to solve it. It seems like some sort of international collaboration is absolutely necessary, and this I think this part is I really liked in your presentation, going back to all these questions of I think Trotskyist ideas of basically, pointing out that no single, you can't have one country which is super clean and green and whatever you want to call it, and, while the rest of the world continues in its own way. And it's kind of like similar question to the question of, that the Bolsheviks had in the beginning of the 20th century. But I also completely agree with you that it does not look like the world is going towards some sort of formally, of course, we have the accords, we have the agreements, climate, whatever, but it doesn't seem like it's that we're actually going that way. It seems much more likely, like you've pointed out, that we're going towards illiberal regimes, that we're going to build up more walls to prevent migration.
I would just intervene right there and say that it's liberal regimes that build up walls. But anyway, finish your comment.
Yeah, okay, but I suppose this is what because I suppose this is precisely what my question is about then, because for me almost it seems that not only is some sort of communal response possible, like communism, if you want. I feel like almost I have to defend liberal democracy. You know what I'm saying?
I do know what
I feel
saying,
almost like liberal democracy is what is in actual danger because of all this.
Well, of course it's in danger. But, so 2 points. I mean, so you say rightly that global warming brings about a realization that forms of international collaboration are necessary. But that's, that's insufficient in itself. That's idealism. One has to produce an account of the conditions of possibility for political organization at an international level. Now, right now, as you rightly point out, liberal democracy are our conditions of possibility for that, or they have been, and those are being fractured. Right? Those are based on American hegemony since the end of the Second World War. And I would note that they create all kinds of forms of violence and collaboration with fascism that I find absolutely unacceptable, for one thing. So just on a moral and political level. But on a second level, of course, it's completely impossible. It's ideology. All of these accords and agreements are nonsense. It's impossible for a system of capitalist states to rationally plan for, their economies on the basis of something like a response to global warming. That is to say, they have to compete over the accumulation of capital. That's the basis of geopolitical, that and military might are the basis of geopolitical power. There's no way that what is the EU doing right now? So the EU knows, right? What are they doing? So Ursula von der Leyen, on the one hand, is, so tamping down export of Chinese electric vehicles within the European market because they're funded by massive state subsidies that make them affordable. So that's one thing that's happened, okay? That's the other thing that's happening is that she just signs an agreement with Tunisia to shunt, would-be migrants into Europe, often in the middle of the desert on the border of Libya, and just leave them to die. And so, where they really are.
That used to be Gaddafi's job, but now,
so what I'm calling for, so climate realism means partly, right? You have to acknowledge that these things are what continue to happen and they will continue to happen. So that's an understanding of liberal democracy as the ideology of capitalism. So it's incumbent upon those who want, what I'm saying is, the forms of international organization and action that you're calling for to produce an analysis of the class relation that implies that that is actually possible. What are the conditions of possibility for that? And what I'm saying is they don't exist. So if one actually carries out an analysis of the transformation of the class relation, there's nowhere in particular that a collective agent is going to emerge within. So just look at Syriza. There you have an actual socialist government. They just get annihilated, and they annihilate themselves. And they don't even, if you want to have so what the EU does, I've just spoken about. Let's say you want to have a different policy. Let's say you call a referendum, should we leave the EU or not? And the population says yes, well, they don't leave, So these are the actual things that take place. And we have to attend to, right? Historical materialism means to attending to the actual class relations that determine, the possibilities for these forms of action.
Just one quick addition. So you were also critical of Andreas Malm, and
my favorite among the thinkers on this issue, yeah.
But you were critical of him in the sense that he does propose solutions which in the end ultimately are a little bit childish. I mean, this comes back to what I think. No?
These solutions, I'm not saying these solutions are childish. I'm saying he's a Leninist, that's fine, okay? I'm in solidarity with Andreas Malm, obviously. And I'm saying he's right, actually, about the kinds of political determination that would be necessary to address the issues. I'm saying that it's not only that he's, okay, it's fine, you're a Leninist, like, no problem. But if you think that that form of collective determination and the prospect of communist internationalism is a real possibility at present, then again, I'm saying it's incumbent upon one to show why that's not anachronistic. So actually Leninists tend to sort of laugh, at like left communist developments, the kinds of analyses of Théorie Communiste that I'm describing. But they don't, the thing is they fail to refute, these arguments about actually the composition of the working class and the effects of the transformation of the process of production since the 1970s. So I want us to say, like, given that transformation of class composition in relation to the process of production and the massive problem of seizing the means of production that it involves, one has to give an answer to why one thinks such a thing is still possible. And they don't, So again, it's like, that's just a debate between communists. That's a strategic debate, fine. But so it's not that I think it's immature or anything like that, absolutely not. It's just that it requires a real analysis, not only of, he's not proposing solutions, he's proposing a strategy, but there's no grounding of the strategy.
Okay, I could already see at least 5 or 6 hands, so let's keep the questions kind of short so that we can have them all and keep going. So we'll have Cosmo and then Ray. You go ahead.
Nathan, first of all, I wanted to thank you for a profoundly insightful and far-reaching articulation of. Yes. Okay. Well, no. But I think it's relevant.
Go ahead with the question. Yeah.
No. I think it's quite relevant because this is how broadly my generation feels. I mean, sorry to single myself out here, but it is absolutely this problem, right? The promises of the kind of classical modes of organizing internationally, organizing even within the context of like a worker commune or like striking or whatever. It's important on a sort of community level, but you're left with sort of like another self-same level of individualism. Almost as prescribed by the kind of neoliberal, go recycle, go after yourself, but like within your own community, the impact is still dissolved. But I suppose my specific question is how you see the more, let's say, reactionary forces that broadly could be dubbed by eco-fascism, but that are also very popular now as, for instance, within the object-oriented ontology people, with like this notion of the hyper climate change is the hyper object, right? which simply seems to be a palliative articulation for Westerners who haven't experienced climate change firsthand. How far can this soothsaying really take us, I suppose, and do you feel like there's an imminent kind of reactionary moment?
Yeah, well, let me leave aside the theoretical orientations you mentioned. I don't think those are worth talking about. But at the level of reactionary responses to climate change, I mean, the question I would pose to liberals is exactly what they think, working people and poor people are supposed to do. Because of course in the United States, everybody hates all these dumb idiots for voting for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump is the result of the Democratic Party aligning itself with Clintonism since the 90s. It is the result, and the left, the so-called left, which is not a homogenous unit, but needs to take responsibility for basically, for one thing, just handing over the critique of globalization to the right. There is no critique of globalization on the left anymore. What is that? This was the core of leftist politics in the 1990s and the early 2000s. It's just been totally abandoned. So it's no surprise, that people in France are pissed off when they get a gas tax because of climate change. And what we see is that, of course, all the energy politically, in terms of collective organization, is on that side. And the reason for that is, in my opinion, just the abandonment of serious working class politics by the left and the abandonment of the critique of globalization by the left. It's amazing to me that if you take a position against the EU today, most of the left thinks that you're either insane or like a Nazi or something. And it's look at the EU's actual politics, and the thing is, the critique of something like Brexit, which obviously gets all its energy from the right, and one does not align oneself with that policy. But it is necessary for states to leave the EU, okay? Greece should have left the EU, but it structurally is difficult to do that, obviously, to say the least. But the thing is, that you get an argument on behalf of, it's as though the EU is some paragon of open borders. This is completely insane. It's the same sort of perspective as you get in the United States, where fascism is a problem when it manifests itself within the country. But whenever it happens anywhere else, who cares, So within the EU, open borders within the EU, but look at the way the EU is treating African migrants. And this situation has to be displaced. And so the left refuses to align itself with, the actual political contradictions that are at issue in the interests of the working class vis-a-vis these questions. And that is why these people, of course, will continue to migrate to the right. Who can blame them? Certainly not me, although I am not, obviously, sympathetic with their politics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And as an English person myself, I was a Lexit person. I don't mind admitting.
Well, I'm sure everybody hates you for that. Yeah, don't worry. Everybody hates me too. Yeah.
Anyway, Ray, it's yours.
So Nathan, thank you. You can hear me all right.
I can hear you.
Yeah. I am in total agreement with your analysis. Thank you. I really love the rigor of your analysis. I'm curious whether you would take up the category that came up in Ara's paper earlier, going back to the old psychoanalytic category of ego-ideal, and whether we cannot, in fact, make a connection between ego-ideal on the one hand and, let's say, the aspiration to certain lifestyles and living standards, right, in liberal democracy. What I'm talking about is a problem that all of you have heard. When you have 1.4 billion Chinese people and 1.4 Indian people, and I don't know the figure from Africa, right, aspiring to the lifestyle of people living in so-called liberal democracies, such as Western Europe and North America, right, is a disaster for the earth. And so that is in part the problem that you are diagnosing so well here. Except that I seem to sense that in a lot of these discussions, people are extremely reluctant to touch on the question of population, right? The sort of explosion of human population and human consumption, and so on. I guess because, as you say, it's absolute alienation. There's no solution for that. And yet I would love to hear some argument about, please, no more babies, no more human reproduction.
Okay.
Let's stop it. And it's not going anywhere, right? I will not be invited to speak anywhere if I were known to say things like that. So I would like to just hear you speak more on those levels.
About population control. Well,
Yeah, where's population in your diagnosis?
you know, I'm not a Malthusian, you know, and I don't. Okay. So look, first of all, yeah, you're right about the problem posed by. Okay, you know, China is basically like a state capitalist, right? I mean, it is to some extent a socialist country, and it is like, you know, I think actually it's very interesting what's happening in China. I think there are many, many things which are very, very interesting in China, you know. But as a state capitalist, that is to say, of course, it's not as though workers are not exploited, et cetera, in China. So China is a state capitalist. So of course it has to encourage consumption, et cetera. I would not situate these things at the level of individual like desires or attunements. You know, this is not my orientation theoretically. So what the citizens of China and India sort of want, I mean, of course, you know, these are forms of aspiration and collective life which are predicated upon the mode of production in those countries, which is a capitalist mode of production, even if it's a state, you know, state-controlled economy. But I do think, so I think what is interesting is the capacity of China to plan its economy. This, of course, is very interesting, but it has to do so in competition with capitalist states. And then so we can see, you know, China is, of course, very important to China to establish hegemony in the global stage, which it is very much in the process of doing. As you point out, that is not going to result, to say the least, in any rational planning vis-a-vis global warming. They'll probably do it better than the EU or the US, but they have to produce, and they are the world's major industrial economy, as we know. And so I just, you know, these are just real impasses. I would also say that, like, so the forms of state authoritarianism that would be required to, like, prevent people from reproducing, you know, I'm not like a sort of bleeding heart liberal about, but nor am I in favor of them. And, you know, the fact of the matter is humans are going to reproduce, you know. And of course, China had that policy, and they've had to abandon that policy for precisely the reasons that I'm talking about. So these are not, I would just say these are not real political possibilities, you know. I mean, whatever we might think ought to be the case one way or another, this is not how things are going to go. So we have to take seriously, at the level of populations, what I'm trying to say is that global warming, you know, you often get these things, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Jameson says, this is an analysis of movies, right? Global warming has nothing to do with the end of the world. It's just, this is not the question. The question is that all these people are going to die, you know? That's the problem. It's not that the world is going to end. It's that, like, we're talking about, like, yeah, probably 500 million people are going to have to migrate, and it's not as though these states are just going to let them in. And so we already know what happens. And so that's the issue at the level of population. And population control doesn't, in some way, wouldn't really bear upon that reality. You know, so that's the class issue that has to be addressed. Yeah.
Okay, I can see many more hands. Do you want to go ahead, Nicholas, and then I'll come over to you?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I also kind of follow on the same lines as you, but my question is a little bit, I mean, to what extent do you think capitalism is able to be really a motor that functions as the one for instance, having the borders, building up the borders, having the technology or drones in your armies, robot armies, and things like that, because it seems that capitalism in itself, specifically the financial capitalistic mode, is in a certain sense killing off capitalism as a way of keeping structures, that is to say, the state somehow balancing it. So I mean, just that might be a factor that really doesn't. I mean, an unknown factor. I think it's very hard to see what's going to happen. But that's just a comment. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's I mean, so of course, you know, what are called the structural contradictions of capitalism are definitely getting worse. You know, so everyone knows that, can feel that, can see that. Even in a rich country like the United States, nobody has any money. You know, 5 people have money. I mean, some people have money, but like nobody can afford anything. You know, so I mean, it's crazy. You know, if you look at the situation now versus the, you know, the post-war boom, the 50s and 60s, you have, I mean, it's kind of comical how little, you know, capitalism has to offer. Even the citizens of wealthy states, and, you know, like when you see these sequences like the Gilets jaunes or whatever, obviously people know this very well. But it's a dangerous dynamic, because what you see then is that, you know, so I don't think that, obviously, and neither has any other serious Marxist ever thought that the contradictions of capitalism are just going to bring about its undoing. And on the contrary, what you will see as those get worse is more and more sort of just like real state violence in terms of borders and control of populations. And already, I mean, one of the reasons I would like to accept the Leninist prescription, but my own political experience and those of people who actually like struggle on the streets, is that the police in these states, you know, it's not 1917. I mean, the degree of like the armament of the police is so insane, you know, that it actually it's just a matter of when they decide to just annihilate you. And so practical struggles, which are based upon, which would be grounded in political violence, that is, actual attempts to overthrow states, things do not bode well for them, you know, and that will only, the violence of these states will only become more severe as their economic conditions of viability degrade. And so all of that, I think, does definitely support, you know, more and more power being sort of shifted to the right, as we see like those, you know, the movements of the right, and the police will sort of allow, you know, them to do things that they will not allow the left to do. So none of that. The contradictions of capitalism getting worse in Western states and international capitalism, like, okay, in one way, you know, it's important that proletarians and surplus populations see that they cannot expect anything. On the other hand, you know, what they're supposed to do about that under these sort of quasi-military conditions of policing, you know, is a very serious question.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Hi. I want to take pause on this phrase, degrowth communism, which you think from the typical working class perspective, what they probably are going to be thinking about that is Davos. They're going to be thinking the way that imperialism goes around the world, uses this degrowth plan to keep the resources in the ground in so-called third world countries. So there's definitely a problem with this language. So if the plan is to reach working class people, to promise them degrowth means less jobs. It means the continuation of heightened class antagonism. So I'm wondering, how would you actually distinguish this sort of nostalgia for what could have been a communist plan for the ecology from the actually existing Davos degrowth plan?
Well, it's not like it's not like degrowth is going to be implemented in a serious way it's just like, I don't care what they say at Davos. I mean, that's not going to happen. But I mean, that's just like, you know, whatever. Is it structural analysis? It makes no sense, right? How could capitalist states tamp down the accumulation of capital? That's just not how the world works. So, but the question of whether this will sort of sell as a political slogan, I mean, okay, yeah, like probably not. But that's not. And you're right. It's very important that, for example, like, you know, African states that have reserves of fossil fuels being told by Europe, like, not to drill them, they're like, no, sorry, we're gonna like sell these fuels to you, like, whatever, you know, and rightly so. So I would just say that, yes, this is my point, is like, it's not to sort of revel in the contradictory nature of these phenomena, but the question is, what actually would, you know, slow and stop warming? I mean, from that perspective, degrowth is the only solution that I can see. I don't think these technological solutions being promulgated by techno-futurists are very serious. You know, so obviously if you want to, it is capitalist accumulation linked to fossil fuels that has created global warming. And of course one needs to get out of a system in which growth is the only criterion. You have to be able to rationally plan what is actually in people's best interest. That is to say, at a broad level, sort of like use value, right? But that's impossible within the capitalist mode of production. Like, you know, systematically, truly, that is not possible. So, that is to say, to stop doing that means to stop being capitalist. It means to stop having a capitalist mode of production. So the problem, the contradiction is just that what I'm interested in, though, is what is actually true. Hey, this is the first step analytically. So one might think, degrowth, well, that's not many people want to hear about that. That's not going to sell. But the question is, what actually would be necessary? You know, and then you worry about the problem of what to do about it. But you can't just be like, oh, well, people don't want degrowth, so, you know, I mean, the analytical question is what is the case, right? So I am persuaded, I'm saying, this is just me, like, but I'm persuaded by these arguments that would be, if it were possible to plan on the basis of what is actually necessary, you know, that would be what would have to happen. And of course that is antithetical to people's desires and to the interests of states that have fossil fuels resources. I agree with you. Yeah.
You okay for a couple more questions, Nathan?
But that's why you understand that I don't think, you know, I think warming is like going to go to like 4 or 6. You know, that I don't think it's going to like, yeah.
You're okay still to carry on for a little bit? Yeah, okay, you go ahead and then we'll come to Barry.
Yeah, okay. I'll again be that guy who says I have more of a comment than a question. I'm sorry in advance.
Fine.
Yeah, sure. But everybody else did. So anyways, like I work actually in Chinese investments, you know, like in the Balkans, and I just like wanted to reply on like what's being said, you know, on Kohei Saito and all of these other people. Basically, on the ground, how it looks like is basically with the outsourcing of production to the Western Balkans, to Africa and whatnot, you have basically, you know, like migration of workers from China. Yes. And clash with local workers. There's like a lot of racism going on. You know, people get beaten up, you know, like, and I think we can, you know, philosophize or whatever. You know, Kohei Saito maybe, you know, how to say, he might want to erase class struggle. I talked with him like recently, and his take basically is he wants to emphasize impersonal domination as this sort of like analytical, you know, like concept that he uses like in, you know, degrowth communism as sort of like, you know, what's his analysis, what's the problem. And I think, okay, that's cool and all, but I think, well, once you actually go on the ground and like look at what's happening, you know, all of these concepts are, you know, they just like kind of fall. Okay, it might be analytically useful, but I think on the ground, like class struggle is going on. And with the outsourcing of production, you know, if some country wants to decarbonize, not talking only about China, but also the EU, you know, like it's going to create clashes on the ground. And, you know, we cannot deny that. We cannot just start from some specific category that we have philosophically invested ourselves into. But as like good materialists, we need to start from what's going on the ground. And I think in a lot of cases, at least like literally with like my own research, I think a lot of the problems come from, you know, people not even knowing empirically what's going on, you know, because there's no research on that, you know, because it's not welcome to being done, you know. Instead, we get a lot of myths, a lot of like even racist and right-wing myths, and this feeds into this rising, you know, riot all over Europe, not only in the Balkans, of course. And I think, you know, we need to be careful which concepts do we use, right? Because if we actually want them to have some sort of reality, you know, we need to start from the reality itself, right? So I just like wanted to comment like on Saito. And one other comment is that I think you're completely on point, like completely on point with regards to the heritage of anti-communism, you know, like during the 20th century. You mentioned it briefly. I think it needs to be definitely expanded because a lot of the failure to tackle climate change comes definitely from that, you know. And I think, like on the ground, we need to undo this sort of anti-communism and this sort of skepticism to any sort of like non-right-wing like solutions. And one final comment is that I think it's very interesting to mention something completely forgotten today, and that is that ecology in itself, by leading politicians, you know, from Indira Gandhi to, I don't know, like even the Praxis school, like why didn't they write on ecology? It's a very important point because ecology was considered reactionary. Why? Because once the former colonies got their like independence, they actually rejected, you know, going in more into ecological controls and regulations because it was thought of a strategy by the Western powers who colonized them previously to keep them from modernizing and to keep them from industrializing and actually catching up with them, you know. So you have even like some sort of instances where Indira Gandhi was actually against that, the non-aligned movement was against that, the Praxis school, even there was only one guy, Rudi Supek, who wrote on that, like he has an ecological book on limits to growth. He was actually ridiculed by his own colleagues for being like a reactionary dude, basically. Okay, so I'll stop because I was talking too long.
So two things. I mean, first of all, just like, I mean, one impression I don't want to create is the impression that like, obviously, socialist states in the 21st century are industrial economies. It's not as though they're trying to like deindustrialize and adopt this. So the point there is like, the only condition of possibility for actual planning that would acknowledge constraints like global warming and rethink an economy on that grounds would obviously have to be, you know, a non-capitalist mode of production. I'm not saying that actually is what, you know, would have been viable in the 20th century. But the second thing I want to say is just, I appreciate your sort of your emphasis on concrete conditions and understanding them. And I would just say there's a lot of people who do this kind of analysis. I mean, particularly left communists have part of the practice of the sort of left communist orientation, of course, is to do analyses of concrete struggles when they pop up in different parts of the world and offer an account of them. I would also say that, you know, on the other level, just something like the New Left Review, you know, at least has a responsible sort of way of evaluating what's going on geopolitically and thinking about it in a way which is not just at the level of a news cycle. So, I think that's very important, and this is why, and I mean, you know, this is why I find so obscene. I really find it, like, morally unacceptable, like the prescriptions of the sort of liberal climate change thing where it's like we should get over anthropocentrism and adopt an attitude of wonder toward it. It's like, are you kidding? I mean, you know, you're talking about hundreds of millions of people who are going to be, and it's like, oh, by changing their attitudes, you know, liberals are going to like shift their relationship to the world. I mean, this is really disgusting, you know? And so I think that like theoretically there has to be a very strong antagonism with, like, at the moment it's just like, oh, there's a bunch of different approaches to global warming. Read this book by Amitav Ghosh, you know, read this book by Jane Bennett or whoever, and here's another book by Andreas Malm. It's like, no, you know, that these discourses are the enemy of any serious reflection on the question, you know, and I think that sort of like polemical position has to be taken up in theory, because it's not okay to suggest that, like, you know, by valuing the plants and animals, which of course we should do, you know, but anyone who's going to do that is already going to do it, you know, and it doesn't make any difference for structural reasons, and that has to be, you know, just acknowledged. I mean,
We're going to have one last question from Alenka.
Thank you very much, Nathan, for this really brilliant talk, also a brilliantly Hegelian talk, in the sense that, you know, Hegel said that it is only possible to produce a really good theory of something after it is over. And I think from your, the way you succeeded to produce a good theory of the, let's say, history of alienation and modernity is precisely something that also suggests that something is over in this story, and perhaps we could put it like the kind of inherent split that was the internal motor of modernity is over. I mean, we are in a way somewhere different, and this absolute alienation is also, I think, one of the good ways to formulate this. So I could not be more in agreement with you, because I think we definitely need this kind of thorough and conceptually rigorous pessimism now, because all this production of hundreds of possibilities and alternatives, I mean, they are really not what will may help us break through to something. And so I agree, I won't even comment at all on your paper, just I would perhaps defend a little bit Fred Jameson, who was mentioned in the response, because at least this is my understanding of this thesis of his, that we can more easily imagine the end of the world.
Yeah.
That I think his idea is precisely like yours, that these apocalyptic images of the end of the world are the way in which we obfuscate something else. So I don't think he, precisely, I think he would agree, this is not about the end of the world, and capitalism, end of capitalism, would not be the end of the world, precisely, but it would, but what we are facing, and this is also this kind of psychological interplay, if you want, what we are, the choice is between, I mean, the end of the world is the easy escape we are offered out of this slow death that you were describing, like hundreds of millions of people just suffering and slowly die. So just to say that I think that at least this is my reading of this thesis, that I think Jameson would actually be very much in agreement with.
No, I completely agree with that, and it's not I didn't mean to criticize Fred Jameson's use of the phrase, just this sort of popular adoption as a kind of slogan, as though, I don't know, like, yes, I agree, thinking about global warming as the end of the world is a fantasy formation that deflects from the actual class politics and the geographical politics of what is and what will take place. And so, yes, I agree with that. The other thing I want to say is that, I would just emphasize, like, I don't want this paper to be understood as like I'm like this is like a zeitgeist or something. It's the analysis is about the displacement of a form of systematic knowledge and its sort of bearing upon the future in the way that Hegel, you know, and then Perry Anderson, like, you know, are thinking through, and analyze via the movement of the concept of alienation and its relation to separation over the past 200 years. And so I want to emphasize that sort of like almost kind of technical aspect of the paper. But also, you know, the other stake of the paper for me is I keep using the phrase outcome of modernity. I agree that we're after something, but, you know, I also wrote this article, Post-Modernity Not Yet. So it's not that modernity is over. Modernity is the history of capitalism. We're in late modernity, we're in late capitalism, which means actually very determinate things. I think about the process of what gets called real subsumption in a way where that produced the post-war boom, and we are sort of after, you know, in fact, like the rate of profit has been declining since the 1970s. This is what I call late modernity and late capitalism. But so we're not in, post-modernity would be a period veritably after the history of capitalism, which we are most certainly not yet in. But I do think what is the temporal sort of torsion is that the outcome of modernity is clear, has become clear from within late modernity. And this is the capacity to shape the outcome of modernity is what has, in my opinion, been like, we are separated from the capacity to shape the outcome of modernity through rational planning. And this is these contradictions that we've been discussing. Oh, what about this? What about that? I mean, exactly. You know, and so, but the project then is to have an analysis of that, which would admit certain things, you know, but also not admit them in a way which has a sort of structural analytical core to it.
No, I mean, I think it's a good place to start. but not stop the discussion, which we should carry on. I have some crazy thoughts about climate change that I think are better saved for the pub, like at the end of the night when no one can remember them. But I mean, that was obviously a fascinating paper, and with loads to talk about, so let's all talk more about it. And thanks so much, everyone. You can go for your lunch now, and we should be back here at 5 o'clock. Is that correct? Upstairs, if you want to join for lunch, we'll just go upstairs. And then is it 5 o'clock that people should be back here at 5 o'clock, same as yesterday? Okay, so thanks, everyone. See you soon.